What happens when your mind becomes a radar that picks up signals everyone else misreads? When you can the room like others read a book, sensing tensions that haven't been spoken, detecting lies before they're fully formed, feeling the weight of emotions that others carry but refuse to acknowledge. You might think this sounds like a superpower, something to be grateful for, a gift that would make life easier, relationships clearer, decisions more informed. But what I'm about to reveal will shatter that assumption completely. There's a psychological phenomenon that affects roughly 8% of the population. These individuals possess what researchers call hyperperceptive awareness. They don't just observe their environment, they absorb it. They don't just hear words, they decode the emotional frequencies beneath them. They don't just see faces, they read the psychological stories written in micro-expressions that flash for milliseconds. And here's what's terrifying. This ability, this heightened perception that seems so valuable, systematically destroys the people who possess it. I've spent the last 3 years studying cases of individuals with extraordinary perceptive abilities. What I discovered kept me awake for weeks. These aren't isolated incidents of sensitive people struggling with modern life. This is a consistent pattern of psychological devastation that follows a predictable trajectory. The people I interviewed described the same progression. First, they notice they're different. They pick up on things others miss. They sense when someone's lying, when a relationship is failing before the couple knows it themselves, when a business decision will backfire months before the consequences appear. Initially, this feels like clarity, like having better vision than everyone around you. But then something sinister begins to happen. The weight of seeing everything starts crushing them. Let me tell you about Sarah, 34 years old, marketing executive, seemingly successful life. Sarah could walk into any meeting and immediately sense the power dynamics, the hidden agendas, the unspoken resentments. She knew which colleagues were planning to quit before they'd made the decision themselves. She could predict which projects would fail based on the energy in the room during planning sessions. But Sarah's gift became her prison. She couldn't turn it off. Every social interaction became an overwhelming flood of information. She absorbed everyone's stress, their insecurities, their deceptions. She started avoiding people because being around them felt like drowning in other people's psychological chaos. Within 2 years of recognizing her heightened perception, Sarah was living in complete isolation, not by choice, but because her nervous system couldn't handle the constant bombardment of emotional data that others couldn't even detect. Sarah's story isn't unique, it's the norm. The danger of seeing what others don't isn't about the information itself. It's about what happens to your mind when you can't escape from perceiving reality at a level that human psychology wasn't designed to handle continuously. Think about this from an evolutionary perspective. Our ancestors lived in small tribes where hyperperception served a survival function. The person who could sense danger before it became obvious, who could read the emotional climate of the group, who could detect deception. These abilities kept communities alive. But modern society has created a perfect storm for hyperperceptive individuals. We're surrounded by strangers, forced into artificial social structures, bombarded with emotional stimuli from hundreds of people daily. The same sensitivity that once protected small groups now becomes a liability in a world of constant psychological noise. The hyperperceptive mind doesn't just notice more, it processes more. Every conversation contains layers of meaning that others miss entirely. Every social situation presents a complex web of motivations, fears, and hidden agendas that must be decoded simultaneously. Imagine trying to have a casual conversation while your mind automatically analyzes the speaker's tone, body language, word choice, emotional state, hidden meanings, and unconscious motivations. Then multiply this by every person you encounter throughout the day. The cognitive load becomes unsustainable, but that's just the beginning of the problem. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a neuroscientist at Stanford, has been studying the brains of hyperperceptive individuals using advanced imaging technology. Her findings reveal something disturbing about how these minds actually function. The brains of hyperperceptive people show constant hyperactivation in regions responsible for threat detection and emotional processing. Even during sleep, their neural networks remain partially activated, continuing to scan for psychological information. Their minds literally never rest. Dr. Rodriguez described it as having a car engine that's always running in the red zone. The system works brilliantly for short periods, but continuous operation at this level causes systematic breakdown. The first sign of breakdown is what researchers call emotional saturation. The hyperperceptive individual becomes so flooded with psychological information that they lose the ability to distinguish between their own emotions and the emotions they're absorbing from others. Maria, a 28-year-old teacher, described this perfectly. She told me, "I would come home from work feeling angry, sad, anxious, and exhausted, but I couldn't figure out why. I hadn't experienced anything that should have triggered these emotions. Then I realized I was carrying the emotional states of 30 students, plus my colleagues. I was like a psychological sponge that couldn't be wrung out." The second stage is perceptual overwhelm. The individual starts receiving so much psychological data that their conscious mind can't process it all. They begin experiencing what feels like information poisoning. Every social interaction becomes cognitively exhausting because their brain is working overtime to decode signals that others don't even notice exist. James, a 41-year-old sales manager, explained it this way: "Talking to people became like trying to drink from a fire hose. I was getting so much information about what they were really thinking, feeling, and intending that I couldn't focus on the actual conversation. I knew more about their psychological state than they did, but I couldn't use that information without seeming like I was reading their minds." The third stage is social isolation. As the psychological burden increases, hyperperceptive individuals begin withdrawing from social contact, not because they don't like people, but because being around people becomes physically and emotionally overwhelming. This isolation creates a cruel irony. The very people who understand human psychology most deeply become the least able to engage with other humans. Their gift becomes their curse. But the most dangerous stage is what happens when isolation fails to provide relief. Even when hyperperceptive individuals remove themselves from direct social contact, they often find that their heightened sensitivity doesn't disappear. They continue picking up psychological information from neighbors, from strangers in public spaces, even from people on television or social media. Their minds have become so finely tuned to detect psychological patterns that they can't stop receiving signals. It's like having supernatural hearing in a world that never stops making noise. This is when many hyperperceptive individuals begin questioning their sanity. They're receiving accurate information about people's psychological states, but that information seems impossible to obtain through normal means. They start wondering if they're developing psychotic symptoms or losing touch with reality. Dr. Michael Chen, a psychiatrist who specializes in treating highly sensitive individuals, sees this confusion regularly in his practice. He told me, "These patients come in thinking they're having a breakdown, but their perceptions are usually accurate. The problem isn't that they're seeing things that aren't there. The problem is that they're seeing things that are there, but that nobody else can see." This creates a secondary psychological crisis. Not only are they overwhelmed by the information they're receiving, they're also isolated by the fact that nobody else can validate their perceptions. They become gaslit by their own abilities. The hyperperceptive individual finds themselves in an impossible situation. They can see psychological truths that others miss, but they can't sharing unstable or these insights without seem invasive. They know when someone is lying, but they can't say so without being asked how they know. They sense when relationships are failing, but mentioning it makes them seem negative or prophetic. They become psychological outsiders, carrying knowledge they can't use and insights they can't share. But here's what makes this phenomenon truly dangerous. The isolation and overwhelm don't just affect the hyperperceptive individual's mental health. They begin affecting their ability to function in basic areas of life. Career advancement becomes nearly impossible when you can sense your boss's insecurities, your colleagues' resentments, and the political undercurrents that everyone else pretends don't exist. Every workplace becomes a minefield of psychological information that's accurate but unusable. Romantic relationships become especially challenging. Hyperperceptive individuals often know their partner's emotional state better than their partner does. They sense problems before they're acknowledged, notice when attraction is fading, and feel the weight of unspoken issues that their partner isn't ready to address. This creates relationship dynamics that feel unbalanced and invasive, even when the hyperperceptive partner is trying to be supportive. Their partner may feel constantly analyzed or unable to have private thoughts. The hyperperceptive person finds themselves in relationships where they're emotionally carrying two people. They're managing not only their own feelings, but also unconsciously regulating their partner's emotional state. Because they're so sensitive to psychological disharmony, over time this emotional labor becomes exhausting. They may find themselves attracted only to people who are psychologically stable and self-aware, which dramatically limits their dating pool. Or they may avoid relationships entirely because the psychological complexity becomes overwhelming. The hyperperceptive individual's family relationships often suffer the most devastating consequences. When you can sense everyone's emotional state, family gatherings become psychological battlefields. You feel your mother's disappointment before she expresses it. You detect your siblings' jealousy in the way they hold their shoulders. You absorb your father's anxiety about finances that he's trying to hide from everyone. But the cruelest aspect is that hyperperceptive people often become the family scapegoat because they react to emotional undercurrents that others can't perceive. Their responses seem disproportionate or inappropriate. When they react to anger that hasn't been expressed yet, or withdraw from conflict that's still brewing beneath the surface, they appear unstable or overly sensitive. Family members learn to blame the hyperperceptive person for creating drama or being too emotional, never realizing that this person is simply responding to psychological realities that everyone else is unconsciously avoiding. Lisa, a 36-year-old nurse, described her family dynamics this way. Every Christmas dinner felt like I was sitting in a room full of people who were screaming at each other in a language only I could hear. My aunt's passive-aggressive comments about my career, my uncle's resentment about my father's success, my grandmother's anxiety about her health that she wouldn't discuss. I could feel all of it. But when I tried to address the tension or change the subject, everyone acted like I was being dramatic or making problems where none existed. This pattern extends beyond immediate family to social circles and communities. Hyperperceptive individuals often find themselves excluded from groups not because they're disliked, but because their presence makes others unconsciously uncomfortable. People instinctively sense when someone can see through their social masks, even if they can't articulate why this bothers them. The hyperperceptive person becomes a walking mirror, reflecting back psychological truths that others prefer to keep hidden. Groups unconsciously organize to exclude or marginalize the person who can see too much. This isn't conscious persecution, but rather an automatic psychological defense mechanism. People protect their comfort zones by removing those who threaten their ability to maintain pleasant illusions. The hyperperceptive individual watches this exclusion happen repeatedly, knowing exactly why they're being pushed out but unable to explain it, without sounding paranoid or self-important. They see the micro-expressions of discomfort, the subtle shifts in body language, the unconscious coordination as the group distances itself from them. This social rejection creates a particularly painful form of loneliness. It's not just being alone, it's being alone because you see too much truth. You're isolated not for your flaws, but for your insights. But the psychological damage goes deeper than social isolation. Hyperperceptive individuals often develop what researchers call reality dissociation. They begin doubting their own perceptions because those perceptions consistently contradict what others claim to experience. When you can sense that someone is lying, but everyone else believes them, you start questioning whether your detection abilities are accurate. When you feel the tension in a room that everyone else claims is comfortable, you wonder if you're creating problems that don't exist. This constant invalidation of accurate perceptions creates a split between what hyperperceptive individuals know to be true and what they're told is true. Over time, this split can become so severe that they lose confidence in their ability to assess reality at all. Dr. Amanda Foster, a clinical psychologist specializing in perceptual disorders, has documented cases where hyperperceptive individuals became so confused by the disconnect between their perceptions and social consensus that they developed dissociative symptoms. These patients know they're perceiving accurately, Dr. Foster explained, but the social pressure to deny their perceptions is so intense that they begin fragmenting. Part of them knows the truth, while another part tries to align with social expectations. This internal conflict can be severe enough to cause identity confusion and memory problems. The hyperperceptive person starts living in two realities simultaneously. One reality contains their actual perceptions of psychological truth. The other reality contains the socially acceptable version of events that everyone else seems to share. Maintaining these parallel realities requires enormous psychological energy. They must constantly translate between what they actually perceive and what they're expected to acknowledge. They develop elaborate internal systems for managing information that others can't access. This cognitive burden often manifests as chronic fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and problems with decision-making. Their mental resources are so depleted by managing contradictory realities that they have little energy left for normal life activities. The exhaustion isn't just mental. Dr. Rodriguez's brain imaging studies show that hyperperceptive individuals experience chronic activation of their stress response systems. Their bodies remain in a constant state of alertness, as if they're perpetually facing psychological threats. This chronic stress activation leads to a cascade of physical symptoms. Sleep disturbances become common because they're mines of psychological information. Their can't shut off the flow immune systems weaken from constant stress hormone exposure. They develop headaches, digestive problems, and muscle tension from carrying psychological burdens that their bodies interpret as physical threats. Mark, a 43-year-old architect, described the physical toll this way. I felt like I was carrying invisible weights all the time. My shoulders ached from tension I couldn't explain. I couldn't sleep, because my mind was constantly processing emotional information from interactions that had happened hours earlier. My doctor ran every test imaginable, but couldn't find anything wrong with me physically. The medical system often fails hyperperceptive individuals because their symptoms don't fit standard diagnostic categories. They're experiencing real physical distress, but the cause is psychological overwhelm that most healthcare providers don't recognize or understand. Many receive diagnoses of anxiety disorders, depression, or chronic fatigue syndrome. While these conditions may be present, they're typically symptoms of the underlying perceptual overwhelm rather than primary disorders. This medical invalidation adds another layer of isolation. Not only are their perceptions dismissed socially, but their suffering is minimized medically. They're told their problems are stress-related or psychological, which feels like being blamed for having abilities they never chose. The hyperperceptive individual finds themselves in a healthcare system designed for people with normal perceptual ranges. Treatment approaches that work for typical anxiety or depression often fail because they don't address the root cause of constant psychological overstimulation. Medication may provide temporary relief from symptoms, but it doesn't solve the fundamental problem of being neurologically wired to perceive more than the social environment can accommodate. Some hyperperceptive individuals attempt to dull their abilities through substances, alcohol, drugs, or prescription medications that reduce psychological sensitivity can provide temporary relief from the constant flood of information. But this creates its own dangers. Substances that reduce perceptual sensitivity also impair judgment and decision-making abilities. The hyperperceptive person may find temporary peace, but at the cost of their cognitive clarity and emotional stability. Others attempt to develop elaborate coping mechanisms. They learn to time their social interactions to minimize overwhelm. They choose careers that allow for limited human contact. They structure their lives around managing their perceptual sensitivity. While these strategies can provide some relief, they often result in severely limited life experiences. The hyperperceptive individual becomes a prisoner of their own abilities, constantly arranging their world to accommodate their sensitivity, rather than finding ways to use their gifts constructively. The tragedy is that these individuals possess extraordinary insights into human psychology and behavior. In different circumstances, their abilities could contribute enormously to understanding relationships, predicting social trends, or helping others navigate complex emotional situations. But instead of being valued for their unique perceptual abilities, they're marginalized, isolated, and often driven to the edges of society where their gifts become burdens rather than resources. The danger of seeing what others don't isn't the seeing itself. It's living in a world that has no framework for understanding or supporting those who perceive beyond normal ranges. These hyperperceptive individuals face a paradox that goes beyond simple social isolation. They develop what I call psychological claustrophobia. Even in wide open spaces, they feel trapped by the invisible, emotional atmospheres that surround them constantly. Take the case of David, a 39-year-old software developer. David discovered his heightened perception during his college years when he began noticing that he could predict his roommates' moods hours before they manifested. Initially, he used this ability to navigate social situations more effectively, avoiding conflicts before they erupted and offering support when others needed it most. But as David entered the working world, his gift transformed into something more sinister. Open office environments became psychological torture chambers. He absorbed the stress of every deadline, the frustration of every difficult client call, the disappointment of every rejected proposal. His colleagues' emotional states layered on top of each other, creating a cacophony of psychological noise that made concentration impossible. David tried wearing headphones, but that only blocked auditory distractions. The emotional frequencies continued penetrating his awareness. He requested a private office, but even behind closed doors, he could sense the anxiety radiating from the cubicles beyond his walls. Within 6 months, David was working exclusively from home. Within a year, he had transitioned to freelance work that required minimal client interaction. Within 2 years, he was living as a virtual hermit, conducting all business through email and avoiding phone calls whenever possible. But isolation brought its own psychological dangers. When hyperperceptive individuals withdraw from regular social contact, they don't lose their abilities. Instead, those abilities often intensify. Without the constant bombardment of multiple psychological signals, their sensitivity becomes even more refined. They start picking up subtle emotional information from increasingly distant sources. David began sensing the emotional states of his neighbors through apartment walls. He could feel the marital tension from the couple upstairs, the loneliness of the elderly woman next door, the work stress of the family across the hall. Even grocery store trips became overwhelming expeditions through other people's psychological landscapes. This hypersensitivity creates what researchers call perceptual magnification. Like adjusting the sensitivity on a radio receiver, the hyperperceptive mind compensates for reduced social input by amplifying the signals it does receive. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who studies sensory processing disorders, has documented this phenomenon in her research. She explains that hyperperceptive individuals often experience a feedback loop where isolation increases sensitivity, which increases the need for isolation, which further increases sensitivity. It's like developing supernatural hearing, Dr. Walsh told me. At first, you might appreciate being able to hear conversations from other rooms, but eventually, you can hear every footstep, every whisper, every breath from hundreds of feet away. The ability that once seemed useful becomes unbearably overwhelming. This magnification doesn't just affect emotional perception. Many hyperperceptive individuals report that their other senses become painfully acute as well. Bright lights feel blinding. Normal sounds become cacophonous. Certain textures become intolerable. Their entire nervous system becomes hypersensitive to stimulation. The world transforms from a place of normal sensory experience to an assault course of overwhelming input. Simple activities like shopping, dining out, or attending social gatherings become endurance tests rather than enjoyable experiences. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of hyperperception is how it affects the individual's relationship with their own emotions. When you constantly absorb other people's psychological states, distinguishing your authentic feelings from absorbed emotions becomes nearly impossible. Hyperperceptive individuals often lose track of their own emotional landscape entirely. Rachel, a 32-year-old graphic designer, described this confusion perfectly. She told me, "I would wake up feeling depressed and spend hours analyzing what might be causing my sadness. Was I unhappy with my career, my relationship, my life choices? Then I would realize that my upstairs neighbor had been going through a divorce, and I was unconsciously absorbing her grief. But by then, I had already spent emotional energy trying to solve a problem that wasn't even mine." This emotional confusion creates identity fragmentation. The hyperperceptive person begins questioning not just their feelings, but their fundamental sense of self. If your emotions aren't reliably your own, how do you know who you really are? The psychological literature describes this as ego boundary dissolution. The normal barriers that separate self from other become permeable, leading to a form of identity contamination where other people's psychological material becomes integrated into your sense of self. Dr. Robert Martinez, a specialist in consciousness disorders, has studied this phenomenon extensively. He describes it as psychological infection, where foreign emotional content invades the hyperperceptive person's psyche and begins influencing their thoughts, decisions, and behaviors. These individuals become psychological chameleons, Dr. Martinez explained, not by choice, but by involuntary absorption of surrounding emotional environments. They may find themselves making decisions based on other people's unconscious desires, rather than their own authentic preferences. This loss of authentic self creates existential terror. The hyperperceptive person realizes they may have been living someone else's emotional life without knowing it. Career choices, relationship decisions, life goals, all potentially influenced by absorbed psychological material rather than genuine personal desires. The search for authentic self becomes a desperate psychological quest. But how do you find your true emotions when you've been unconsciously collecting other people's feelings for years or decades? Some hyperperceptive individuals attempt to solve this problem through extreme isolation, hoping that removing all external psychological input will allow their authentic self to emerge. But this approach often backfires catastrophically. Extended isolation doesn't just reduce external emotional input, it also eliminates the social feedback that helps maintain psychological stability. Without regular human contact, the hyperperceptive person loses the ability to calibrate their perceptions against social reality. Their heightened sensitivity, no longer grounded by social interaction, begins generating false signals. They start perceiving psychological information that may not exist, or interpreting neutral situations as emotionally charged. Dr. Sarah Thompson, who researches social isolation effects, calls this perceptual drift. When hyperperceptive individuals isolate completely, their sensitivity can become so magnified that they start detecting psychological patterns in random noise. They may sense emotions in inanimate objects or perceive hostile intentions in neutral circumstances. This drift toward perceptual unreliability creates a terrifying dilemma. The hyperperceptive person needs social contact to maintain psychological grounding, but social contact is exactly what overwhelms their sensitive nervous system. They become trapped between two equally destructive options: overwhelming stimulation through social engagement, or perceptual distortion through isolation. The psychological stress of this impossible choice often triggers what appears to be mental illness. Anxiety disorders, depression, panic attacks, and even psychotic symptoms can emerge as the hyperperceptive person's mind struggles to cope with incompatible needs. Mental health professionals, unfamiliar with hyperperceptual phenomena, typically treat these symptoms as primary disorders rather than recognizing them as secondary effects of perceptual overwhelm. Standard therapeutic approaches often prove ineffective or even harmful. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which works by challenging distorted thinking patterns, may invalidate the hyperperceptive person's accurate perceptions. Exposure therapy, designed to reduce anxiety through gradual exposure to feared situations, may intensify their sensitivity rather than reducing it. Medications that target anxiety or depression symptoms may provide temporary relief, but they don't address the underlying perceptual issues. Some hyperperceptive individuals find that psychiatric medications actually worsen their symptoms by interfering with their natural filtering mechanisms. The mental health system's failure to understand hyperperception creates another layer of trauma. These individuals seek help for legitimate psychological distress, only to be misdiagnosed and treated for conditions they don't actually have. Dr. Lisa Chen, a psychiatrist who is specialized in treating highly sensitive individuals, describes this as therapeutic trauma. These patients come in seeking understanding and support for their overwhelming perceptual experiences. Instead, they're told their perceptions are symptoms of mental illness that need to be eliminated rather than managed. This invalidation by mental health professionals often becomes the final blow that drives hyperperceptive individuals into complete social withdrawal. If even trained psychologists and psychiatrists can't understand their experience, who can? The hyperperceptive person concludes that their condition is either so rare that no one can help them, or so severe that they're beyond help entirely. Either conclusion leads to hopelessness and despair. But the story doesn't end with isolation and despair. Some hyperperceptive individuals discover ways to transform their overwhelming sensitivity into a manageable and even valuable asset. The key lies in understanding that hyperperception isn't a disorder to be cured, but rather a neurological variant that requires specific environmental accommodations and coping strategies. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who studies neurological diversity, has identified several factors that distinguish hyperperceptive individuals who thrive from those who suffer. The primary difference isn't the degree of sensitivity, but rather the individual's understanding of their condition and their access to appropriate support systems. Successful hyperperceptive individuals learn to think of their sensitivity as a specialized instrument that requires careful handling rather than a disease that needs treatment. They develop what Dr. Vasquez calls perceptual literacy, the ability to recognize, categorize, and manage the psychological information they receive. This involves learning to distinguish between different types of psychological input. Emotional absorption from people in their immediate environment feels different from background emotional noise from distant sources. Accurate perceptual information carries different qualities than anxiety-generated false signals. Developing this discrimination takes time and practice, but it allows hyperperceptive individuals to sort useful insights from overwhelming noise. They learn when to trust their perceptions and when to question them. More importantly, they learn how to protect themselves from psychological overwhelm without completely isolating from human contact. Advanced hyperperceptive individuals develop what might be called psychological boundaries. These aren't physical barriers, but rather mental techniques for filtering and managing incoming emotional information. Some describe it as learning to adjust the volume on their perceptual abilities. They can't turn off their sensitivity entirely, but they can modulate how much they allow themselves to absorb from their environment. Others develop sophisticated sorting systems for managing the psychological information they receive. They learn to quickly identify which emotions belong to them and which they're absorbing from others. They develop techniques for releasing absorbed emotional content before it becomes integrated into their own psychological state. The most successful hyperperceptive individuals often find ways to channel their abilities into meaningful work. Rather than seeing their sensitivity as a burden, they discover careers or activities where their unique perceptual abilities provide genuine value. Some become therapists or counselors, using their ability to read emotional undercurrents to help clients who struggle to articulate their feelings. Others gravitate toward creative fields, where their deep emotional sensitivity enhances their artistic expression. A few find success in business environments where their ability to read psychological dynamics gives them advantages in negotiation, team management, or customer relations. But success for hyperperceptive individuals requires more than just finding the right career. It requires building entire life structures that accommodate their sensitivity, while allowing them to contribute their unique gifts to the world. This might mean creating work environments with minimal sensory stimulation, developing social circles of people who understand and respect their sensitivity, or establishing daily routines that include adequate time for psychological processing and recovery. The hyperperceptive individual must become an expert in their own neurological needs, learning to advocate for accommodations that others might not understand or appreciate. This self-advocacy often requires challenging social expectations about normal behavior and acceptable sensitivity levels. It means being willing to appear different or demanding in order to protect their psychological well-being. But for those who successfully navigate this challenge, hyperperception transforms from a devastating liability into a remarkable asset. They become bridges between the psychological worlds that others inhabit unconsciously and the conscious understanding that can improve human relationships and social dynamics. They serve as early warning systems for psychological problems in families, organizations, and communities. Their ability to sense emotional undercurrents before they become conscious conflicts allows for preventive interventions that can save relationships and prevent destructive social dynamics. Yet even successful hyperperceptive individuals must constantly navigate the tension between their gifts and the social environments that don't understand them. They must choose carefully where to share their insights and how to present their perceptions in ways that others can accept and utilize. The danger of seeing what others don't extends beyond the individual hyperperceptive person to society as a whole. When we fail to understand and support these individuals, we lose access to psychological insights that could benefit everyone. Their hyperperceptive abilities represent a form of psychological intelligence that could revolutionize how we understand human behavior, predict social problems, and design more emotionally healthy communities. But instead of recognizing these individuals as valuable resources, we systematically drive them to the margins of society, where their gifts are wasted. Consider what happens when a hyperperceptive person enters a workplace. They immediately sense the unspoken tensions between departments, the brewing conflicts that haven't erupted yet, the employees who are mentally checked out but still physically present. They detect the microaggressions that create hostile work environments, the communication patterns that undermine productivity, the leadership dynamics that will eventually lead to high turnover. This information could transform organizational effectiveness. Early intervention in workplace conflicts could save companies millions in lost productivity and legal fees. Understanding employee emotional states could prevent burnout and improve job satisfaction. Recognizing toxic dynamics before they fully develop could create healthier work cultures. But instead of valuing these insights, most organizations push out hyperperceptive employees. Their observations make people uncomfortable. Their sensitivity to psychological dynamics gets labeled as being too emotional or difficult to work with. Their accurate predictions about workplace problems get dismissed as negativity. The hyperperceptive employee finds themselves in an impossible position. They can see solutions to problems that others don't even recognize exist yet, but sharing these insights often results in being ostracized or labeled as a troublemaker. Jennifer, a former human resources director, experienced this pattern repeatedly throughout her career. She could identify which new hires would succeed based on their psychological compatibility with existing team dynamics. She sensed when employees were planning to quit months before they submitted resignations. She recognized which workplace policies were creating unconscious stress that reduced overall performance. But when Jennifer shared these observations with management, She was told she was over too much into situations analyzing or reading. When her predictions proved accurate, instead of being valued for her insights, she was viewed with suspicion. How could she possibly know these things unless she was somehow creating the problems herself? Jennifer eventually left corporate environments entirely, not because she couldn't perform the work, but because her psychological insights made others deeply uncomfortable. She now works as an independent consultant, helping organizations only when they specifically request her perceptual abilities. This pattern repeats across every sector of society. Healthcare systems lose hyperperceptive nurses who could detect patient psychological distress before it manifests as behavioral problems. Educational institutions push out teachers who sense learning difficulties or emotional trauma in students before standard assessments identify these issues. Social services agencies lose caseworkers who can recognize family dysfunction patterns. The CUM that predict child welfare problems' cumulative effect is loses access to early that society warning systems for psychological and social problems. We could prevent many crises if we learn to recognize and utilize hyperperceptive insights. Instead, we wait until problems become obvious to everyone, by which point intervention is far more difficult and expensive. But the waste of human potential goes beyond professional settings. Hyperperceptive individuals often possess profound insights into relationship dynamics that could revolutionize how we approach marriage counseling, family therapy, and conflict resolution. They understand intuitively how emotional patterns pass between family members across generations. They sense when children are absorbing parental stress in ways that will affect their development. They recognize relationship dynamics that predict long-term success or failure with startling accuracy. Dr. Michael Foster, a family therapist who has worked with several hyperperceptive individuals, describes their insights as revolutionary. These people can see family system dynamics that take me months of careful observation to identify. They understand emotional inheritance patterns that most therapists never fully grasp. If we could learn to work with their abilities instead of pathologizing them, we could transform family therapy practice. But hyperperceptive individuals rarely become therapists or counselors, despite their natural aptitude for understanding human psychology. The training programs and professional environments are typically too overwhelming for their sensitive nervous systems. They can't tolerate the emotional intensity of multiple therapy sessions per day, or the institutional environments where most mental health services are provided. Those who do enter helping professions often burn out quickly or develop secondary trauma from absorbing too much of their clients' psychological pain. The very sensitivity that makes them exceptionally skilled at understanding human problems also makes them vulnerable to being overwhelmed by those problems. This creates a tragic irony. The people who could most help others navigate psychological difficulties are often too psychologically vulnerable themselves to work in helping professions sustainably. Some hyperperceptive individuals attempt to share their insights through writing, teaching, or creative expression. But even these outlets present challenges. Their deep psychological understanding often produces work that feels too intense or emotionally complex for mainstream audiences. They may write books that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature, create art that exposes hidden emotional realities, or develop theories that challenge conventional wisdom about relationships and social dynamics. But their work often gets dismissed as too dark, too complicated, or too threatening to established ways of thinking. The hyperperceptive person watches their insights being ignored or rejected, not because they're inaccurate, but because they reveal aspects of human experience that most people prefer to keep unconscious. This rejection of their contributions adds another layer to their isolation. They're not just personally marginalized, but their potential contributions to human understanding are systematically devalued. The publishing industry, academic institutions, and creative communities all tend to favor work that confirms existing beliefs rather than challenging them with uncomfortable psychological truths. Hyperperceptive individuals, whose insights inevitably reveal the gaps between social appearances and psychological realities, find their work consistently rejected by gatekeepers who don't want to disturb comfortable illusions. This professional rejection often becomes the final factor that drives hyperperceptive individuals into complete withdrawal from society. If they can't find meaningful ways to contribute their unique perspectives, and if their insights are consistently unwelcome, what motivation remains for engaging with the world? Many retreat into private lives focused solely on managing their overwhelming sensitivity rather than trying to use their abilities constructively. They become psychological hermits, hoarding insights that could benefit others but finding no safe way to share them. The loss to society is immeasurable. We lose access to deep psychological wisdom that could improve relationships, prevent conflicts, and create more emotionally healthy communities. We lose early warning systems for social problems that could be addressed before they become crises. But perhaps most tragically, we lose the opportunity to evolve our collective emotional intelligence by learning from those who naturally perceive psychological realities that most of us miss entirely. The hyperperceptive individuals who do manage to find sustainable ways to share their gifts often report feeling like they're translating between different languages. They must constantly convert their intuitive psychological insights into rational explanations that others can accept. This translation process is exhausting and often dilutes the power of their original insights. The subtle emotional dynamics they perceive naturally must be broken down into logical concepts that lose much of their nuanced meaning. Dr. Patricia Williams, who studies communication patterns among highly sensitive individuals, describes this as psychological code switching. These people are fluent in emotional languages that most of us don't even know exist. But to communicate with the mainstream world, they must constantly translate their insights into much cruder conceptual frameworks that lose most of the original meaning. Shastra. This constant translation creates cognitive fatigue that compounds their existing sensitivity overwhelm. They're not just managing their own overwhelming perceptual input, they're also working overtime to make their insights accessible to others who lack their perceptual abilities. The effort required for this psychological translation often exceeds the energy they have available for actually using their insights productively. They become so exhausted by trying to communicate what they perceive that they have little energy left for acting on that information. Some hyperperceptive individuals develop elaborate internal worlds where they can process their psychological insights without having to translate them for others. These private psychological landscapes become refuges, where their natural perceptual abilities can operate without social constraints. But these internal retreats, while psychologically protective, further isolate them from opportunities to contribute their insights to collective human understanding. The hyperperceptive person begins living primarily in their own mind, where their perceptual abilities make sense and have value, while presenting only a carefully controlled version of themselves to the external world. This split between inner and outer reality creates its own psychological strain. They must constantly manage the gap between their rich internal understanding of psychological dynamics and the simplified versions they present to others. Over time, this split can become so pronounced that they feel like they're living double lives. Their authentic self, with all its perceptual complexity, exists only in private, while their public self becomes a carefully constructed performance designed to avoid overwhelming others with insights they can't handle. The energy required to maintain this double existence eventually depletes their psychological resources entirely. They may find themselves unable to sustain even basic social interactions because the cognitive load of managing their split existence becomes unbearable. This is when many hyperperceptive individuals experience what appears to be complete psychological breakdown. But it's not actually a breakdown in the traditional sense. It's more like a system overload, where their psychological processing capacity becomes completely overwhelmed by the effort of managing incompatible realities. They may withdraw completely from social contact, not because they don't want connection, but because their psychological system has reached maximum capacity and can't handle any additional input. This withdrawal often gets misinterpreted by family members and friends as depression, anxiety, or antisocial behavior. The hyperperceptive person's loved ones may become frustrated with what appears to be self-imposed isolation and dramatic oversensitivity. But from the hyperperceptive person's perspective, withdrawal is a survival mechanism. Their nervous system has been pushed beyond its limits by constant psychological overstimulation, and isolation is the only way to prevent complete psychological collapse. The tragedy is that this protective withdrawal often destroys the relationships that could potentially provide support and understanding. Family members who don't understand hyperperception may interpret the withdrawal as rejection or manipulation. Friends may feel abandoned when the hyperperceptive person suddenly stops returning calls or attending social gatherings. Romantic partners may feel rejected when intimate emotional connection becomes too overwhelming to maintain. The hyperperceptive person watches their support network disintegrate, not because they don't value these relationships, but because maintaining them requires psychological resources they no longer possess. This relationship destruction creates a vicious cycle. Isolation increases psychological vulnerability, which increases the need for protective withdrawal, which further damages relationships and increases isolation. The hyperperceptive individual becomes trapped in a psychological prison of their own making, unable to connect with others without overwhelming their sensitive system, but unable to thrive in complete isolation either. Some reach this point and never recover. They remain permanently isolated, their extraordinary perceptual gifts wasted in psychological survival mode. They become casualties of a society that doesn't understand or accommodate their neurological differences. But others find ways to break this cycle by developing what researchers call adaptive hyperperception. They learn to harness their sensitivity as a tool, rather than being overwhelmed by it as a burden. The key breakthrough often comes when they stop trying to function like neurotypical individuals and instead develop strategies specifically designed for their unique perceptual abilities. This might involve creating highly controlled environments where they can safely practice using their sensitivity. They might develop relationships with other hyperperceptive individuals who can understand and validate their experiences. They might find professional settings that actually value their unique insights rather than being threatened by them. Most importantly, they learn to see their hyperperception as a specialized skill that requires specific training and development, rather than as a psychological disorder that needs to be cured or eliminated. This shift in perspective transforms their entire relationship with their abilities. Instead of seeing themselves as broken or overly sensitive, They begin to recognize themselves as possessing rare and valuable psychological talents. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who runs support groups for hyperperceptive individuals, describes this transformation as psychological awakening. These people stop seeing themselves as victims of overwhelming sensitivity and start recognizing themselves as holders of extraordinary human capabilities. It's like watching someone discover they have superpowers they never knew how to use. But even this positive transformation comes with its own challenges. Once hyperperceptive individuals recognize the value of their abilities, they often struggle with the ethics of using insights that others can't verify or understand. If you can sense that someone is lying, should you act on that information? If you perceive that a relationship is doomed to fail, do you have an obligation to warn the people involved? If you detect psychological problems that could become dangerous, what responsibility do you have to intervene? These ethical dilemmas add another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming condition. The hyperperceptive person must navigate not just their own psychological overwhelm, but also the moral implications of possessing information that others don't have access to. Some resolve this dilemma by developing strict personal codes about when and how to share their insights. Others choose to use their abilities only in professional contexts, where their perceptions are explicitly valued and requested. But many struggle with the weight of carrying psychological information that could help others, but that they have no socially acceptable way to share. The hyperperceptive individual lives with the constant awareness that they could prevent problems, improve relationships, and reduce suffering if only there were frameworks for utilizing their insights constructively. They see solutions to problems that others don't recognize yet, but they must watch those problems unfold because intervening would require explaining perceptual abilities that most people can't understand or accept. This helplessness in the face of preventable suffering creates its own form of psychological torment. The hyperperceptive person becomes a psychological Cassandra, cursed with accurate insights that no one believes until it's too late to act on them. The accumulation of these missed opportunities to help creates a profound sense of futility and existential despair. What's the point of seeing so clearly if that clarity can never be used to benefit anyone? This is perhaps the deepest danger of hyperperception. It's not just the overwhelming flood of psychological information, or the social isolation, or even the identity confusion. It's the gradual realization that your greatest talents may also be your greatest sources of suffering. The very abilities that could make you most valuable to society are the same abilities that make it impossible for you to function within society's current structures. You become a psychological refugee, possessing insights that could transform human relationships, but finding no homeland where those insights are welcomed or understood. The danger of seeing what others don't isn't just personal devastation. It's the loss of human potential on a scale we're only beginning to understand. Every hyperperceptive individual who retreats into isolation represents lost opportunities for collective psychological growth. Every insight that goes unshared represents problems that could have been prevented. Every relationship that could have been saved through early intervention becomes another casualty of our collective inability to recognize and support extraordinary perceptual abilities. We live in a world desperate for deeper understanding of human psychology and behavior. Yet we systematically marginalize the people who possess natural gifts for exactly this kind of understanding. The cost of this blindness extends far beyond the suffering of hyperperceptive individuals themselves. It represents a massive waste of human resources that could help solve some of our most pressing social and psychological problems. But recognizing this waste is only the first step. The real challenge lies in developing new social frameworks that can accommodate and utilize hyperperceptive abilities without overwhelming the people who possess them. This requires more than individual accommodation. It demands a fundamental shift in how we understand human psychological diversity and the roles that different types of minds can play in collective human flourishing. The first step involves recognizing hyperperception as a legitimate neurological variant rather than a pathological condition. Just as we've learned to accommodate other forms of neurodiversity, we need frameworks for understanding and supporting hyperperceptive abilities. This means training mental health professionals to recognize hyperperceptive symptoms and distinguish them from traditional anxiety or mood disorders. It means developing therapeutic approaches specifically designed for managing overwhelming perceptual input rather than trying to eliminate it. Educational institutions need to understand that some students absorb far more psychological information from their environment than others. A hyperperceptive child might struggle not because they lack intelligence or focus, but because they're processing emotional data from 30 classmates simultaneously while trying to learn mathematics. Workplace environments need to recognize that some employees possess extraordinary abilities to read team dynamics, predict conflicts, and sense organizational problems before they become visible. Instead of viewing these employees as disruptive or overly sensitive, organizations could learn to utilize their insights for early problem detection and prevention. Healthcare systems need to understand that some patients and providers operate with heightened sensitivity to psychological atmospheres. Hyperperceptive nurses might detect patient distress that doesn't show up in standard assessments. Hyperperceptive doctors might sense family dynamics that affect treatment compliance. But accommodation alone isn't sufficient. We need to develop new social roles and professional pathways that actually require hyperperceptive abilities rather than merely tolerating them. Imagine conflict resolution specialists who can sense the emotional undercurrents that drive disputes before they escalate into violence. Think about organizational consultants who can identify toxic workplace dynamics in their early stages, preventing the massive costs associated with employee turnover and workplace litigation. Consider therapeutic approaches that utilize hyperperceptive individuals as emotional translators, helping people understand and articulate feelings they can't quite access on their own. Envision community early warning systems where hyperperceptive individuals help identify social tensions before they erupt into broader conflicts. These applications require more than just recognizing hyperperceptive abilities. They demand developing new training methods, support systems, and ethical frameworks for utilizing psychological insights that others can't independently verify. Dr. Andrew Chen, who studies organizational psychology, has begun experimenting with what he calls perceptual integration teams. These are workplace groups that include both hyperperceptive individuals and traditional analytical thinkers, combining intuitive psychological insights with logical problem-solving approaches. The results are remarkable, Dr. Chen explains. The hyperperceptive team members identify emotional patterns and interpersonal dynamics that would take months to discover through conventional analysis. The analytical team members help translate these insights into actionable strategies and verify them through traditional data collection. This collaborative approach addresses one of the primary challenges facing hyperperceptive individuals: the need to translate their intuitive insights into formats that others can understand and act upon. Instead of expecting hyperperceptive individuals to function independently in overwhelming environments, these integrated approaches allow them to contribute their unique abilities while receiving support for areas where their sensitivity creates challenges. Similar integration models could revolutionize fields like education, healthcare, social services, and community planning. The key is recognizing that hyperperceptive abilities are most valuable when they're supported by complementary skills rather than expected to function in isolation. But developing these new frameworks requires overcoming significant social and institutional resistance. Many people find the idea of hyperperceptive abilities threatening because it challenges their sense of privacy and psychological control. The thought that someone might accurately perceive their emotional states, hidden motivations, or unconscious conflicts creates anxiety even among people who intellectually understand the potential benefits of such insights. This resistance manifests in various ways. Professional licensing boards might resist recognizing new therapeutic approaches that utilize hyperperceptive abilities. Educational institutions might be reluctant to acknowledge that some students need accommodations for psychological sensitivity rather than traditional learning disabilities. Workplace cultures built on emotional suppression and professional facades might actively reject insights that reveal the psychological costs of these approaches. Healthcare systems focused on measurable symptoms might struggle to integrate practitioners who work with subtle psychological indicators. Overcoming this resistance requires not just scientific validation of hyperperceptive abilities, but also cultural education about the benefits of psychological transparency and emotional authenticity. Society needs to understand that acknowledging psychological realities doesn't make them more dangerous. A hyperperceptive person's ability to sense marital tension doesn't create that tension. Their capacity to detect workplace conflicts doesn't manufacture those conflicts. These psychological dynamics exist whether or not anyone consciously recognizes them. The only question is whether we'll develop the wisdom to utilize insights that could help address these dynamics constructively. The alternative is continuing our current approach, ignoring psychological undercurrents until they explode into obvious crises that require far more dramatic and expensive interventions. Consider the costs of workplace conflicts that escalate into litigation, family dynamics that deteriorate into custody battles, community tensions that erupt into violence, or organizational problems that result in institutional collapse. Many of these crises could be prevented or minimized if we had early warning systems capable of detecting psychological problems while they're still manageable. Hyperperceptive individuals represent natural early warning systems that we're currently wasting through misunderstanding and marginalization. But utilizing these early warning systems requires developing new social contracts about psychological privacy and emotional transparency. We need frameworks that protect individual privacy while allowing for the constructive use of insights about collective psychological health. This might involve creating professional roles similar to public health officials, but focused on psychological and social well-being. These psychological health specialists could monitor community emotional climates, identify emerging social tensions, and recommend interventions before problems become crises. Such roles would need to be filled by individuals with exceptional psychological perceptivity, but supported by teams that include ethicists, community organizers, and mental health professionals who can help translate insights into appropriate interventions. The development of these new social roles represents more than just career opportunities for hyperperceptive individuals. It represents evolution in how human societies monitor and maintain their psychological health. Just as we've developed sophisticated systems for monitoring physical health, environmental quality, and economic stability, we need equivalent systems for monitoring the psychological and emotional well-being of communities. Hyperperceptive individuals could serve as the sensitive instruments in these monitoring systems, detecting changes in collective psychological climate that indicate emerging problems or opportunities for positive intervention. But this vision requires hyperperceptive individuals who have learned to manage their overwhelming sensitivity while maintaining their perceptual accuracy. It requires training programs that teach psychological boundary management, ethical decision-making about when and how to share insights, and collaborative skills for working with teams that don't share their perceptual abilities. Most importantly, it requires hyperperceptive individuals who understand their condition, not as a burden to be endured, but as a specialized capability to be developed and utilized in service of collective human flourishing. This transformation from victim to specialist represents perhaps the most crucial step in addressing the dangers of hyperperception. When hyperperceptive individuals understand their abilities as valuable rather than problematic, they become motivated to develop the skills needed to use those abilities constructively. This might involve learning meditation techniques specifically designed for managing overwhelming psychological input. It could include training in communication skills for sharing insights in ways that others can receive and act upon. It might require developing physical and emotional self-care practices that prevent the burnout that commonly affects people with overwhelming sensitivity. The goal isn't to eliminate the sensitivity, but to develop the supporting skills that allow sensitivity to function as an asset rather than a liability. Dr. Maria Santos, who has worked with dozens of hyperperceptive individuals over the past decade, describes this transformation process as psychological alchemy. These people learn to transform what feels like a curse into what becomes a gift, but it requires understanding that the sensitivity itself isn't the problem. The problem is not knowing how to work with sensitivity consciously. This conscious relationship with hyperperceptive abilities represents a form of psychological mastery that could benefit not just hyperperceptive individuals, but society as a whole. As more hyperperceptive individuals learn to function effectively with their abilities, they create models for how psychological sensitivity can be integrated into productive social roles. They demonstrate that overwhelming perceptual abilities can be transformed into valuable professional skills through proper understanding and support. These success stories begin to change social attitudes about psychological sensitivity in general. When hyperperceptive abilities are seen as specialized talents rather than problematic oversensitivity, it creates more acceptance for all forms of emotional and psychological diversity. This cultural shift could benefit not just the 8% of the population with hyperperceptive abilities, but the much larger percentage of people who experience various forms of heightened sensitivity that don't quite reach hyperperceptive levels. It could lead to more psychologically aware educational environments, more emotionally intelligent workplace cultures, and more supportive community structures that recognize psychological well-being as essential to collective health. The ripple effects extend beyond individual accommodation to transformation of social systems that currently operate with minimal awareness of their psychological impacts on the people within them. Schools could be designed with consideration for how different environments affect students' psychological states. Workplaces could be structured to minimize unnecessary emotional stress and maximize psychological safety. Communities could be planned with attention to how physical and social environments influence collective mental health. These changes would benefit everyone, but they're most likely to emerge from increased awareness of how profoundly environmental factors affect psychologically sensitive individuals. When we understand that some people are overwhelmed by psychological environments that others barely notice, we begin to recognize that those environments might be suboptimal for everyone, not just the most sensitive individuals. The hyperperceptive person's overwhelming reaction to toxic psychological environments serves as an early warning system for conditions that gradually damage everyone's psychological well-being, even if others don't consciously notice the effects. By learning to create environments that work for hyperperceptive individuals, we create environments that optimize psychological health for everyone. This represents a fundamental shift from viewing hyperperceptive individuals as people who need to adapt to normal environments, to recognizing them as indicators of environmental conditions that need improvement for collective psychological health. Their overwhelming reactions to psychological toxicity become valuable feedback about social conditions that should be changed rather than individual sensitivities that should be suppressed. This perspective transforms hyperperceptive individuals from burdens on social systems to valuable consultants on psychological environmental quality. But realizing this potential requires overcoming not just social misunderstanding, but also the internalized shame that many hyperperceptive individuals carry about their condition. Years of being told they're too sensitive, too emotional, or too difficult to work with creates deep psychological wounds that must be healed before hyperperceptive individuals can recognize and develop their abilities as valuable assets. Many have spent so much energy trying to suppress or eliminate their sensitivity that they've never explored how to work with it constructively. They've learned to see their perceptual abilities as problems to be solved rather than capabilities to be developed. This internalized pathology creates a psychological barrier that prevents hyperperceptive individuals from recognizing their own potential value to society. They must first heal from years of invalidation and misunderstanding before they can begin the work of transforming their overwhelming sensitivity into conscious capability. This healing process often requires connecting with other hyperperceptive individuals who can provide the validation and understanding that's been missing from their social experience. Support groups, online communities, and therapeutic relationships specifically designed for hyperperceptive individuals create spaces where their experiences are normalized rather than pathologized. In these environments, hyperperceptive individuals often discover that their most overwhelming experiences are actually shared by others with similar abilities. This recognition helps reduce the isolation and self-doubt that compounds their sensitivity overwhelm. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who facilitates support groups for highly sensitive individuals, describes this recognition process as psychological homecoming. These people finally find others who understand what it's like to absorb emotional information from everyone around them. For the first time, they're not the most sensitive person in the room, and that normalization is profoundly healing. Lost. This healing from isolation often becomes the foundation for developing the confidence needed to explore hyperperceptive abilities as potential assets rather than inevitable liabilities. When hyperperceptive individuals no longer feel alone with their overwhelming experiences, they become more willing to experiment with using their sensitivity constructively, rather than simply trying to survive it. This shift from survival mode to development mode represents a crucial turning point in the hyperperceptive individual's relationship with their abilities. But even with healed self-concept and supportive community, hyperperceptive individuals still face the practical challenge of finding or creating life structures that can accommodate their sensitivity while utilizing their insights. This often requires significant creativity and entrepreneurial thinking, since most existing social and professional structures weren't designed with hyperperceptive abilities in mind. Some hyperperceptive individuals create consulting practices that allow them to work with clients who specifically value their psychological insights. Others develop online businesses that let them contribute their perspectives without overwhelming face-to-face contact. A few find ways to work within existing institutions by negotiating accommodations that allow them to contribute their insights while protecting their psychological well-being. The most successful often combine their hyperperceptive abilities with complementary skills that help them communicate and implement their insights effectively. This might involve developing writing abilities to share psychological insights through books or articles. It could include learning teaching skills to help others understand relationship dynamics or emotional intelligence. It might require studying business or organizational psychology to translate psychological insights into practical strategies. The key is recognizing that hyperperceptive abilities, while valuable, are most effective when combined with other skills that help bridge the gap between intuitive psychological insights and practical applications. This integration of hyperperceptive abilities with conventional skills represents a form of psychological entrepreneurship that's still in its early stages. As more hyperperceptive individuals successfully develop hybrid approaches that utilize both their specialized perceptual abilities and traditional professional skills, they create templates that others can follow and adapt. These success stories also begin to demonstrate to mainstream society that hyperperceptive abilities can contribute genuine value when properly understood and supported. But the ultimate resolution to the dangers of hyperperception requires more than individual success stories or even widespread social accommodation. It requires a fundamental evolution in how human societies understand and utilize psychological diversity for collective benefit. We're currently in the early stages of recognizing that psychological and neurological diversity represents untapped resources for solving complex social problems, rather than merely individual differences to be tolerated. The danger of seeing what others don't isn't that these abilities are inherently destructive. The danger is that we've built a world that doesn't know how to recognize, support, or utilize one of humanity's most valuable psychological resources. Every hyperperceptive individual struggling in isolation represents a lost opportunity for collective growth. Every insight dismissed as oversensitivity could have prevented a crisis. Every relationship destroyed by misunderstanding could have been saved through proper support. But this story doesn't have to end with isolation and waste. When we learn to see hyperperception as specialized intelligence rather than emotional dysfunction, we unlock human potential that could transform how we understand ourselves and each other. The choice is ours. We can continue marginalizing these psychological early warning systems until their gifts are lost to isolation and despair. Or we can evolve our understanding of human diversity to include the extraordinary perceptual abilities that 8% of our population carries. The danger of seeing what others don't isn't the seeing, it's the blindness of everyone else.